Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back. This is part two of me talking about the books I read in January 2022, and I wanted to split it up because it was getting a bit long, but as I mentioned in the previous video, by all means, I'm kind of in two minds about this at the moment. I really sort of appreciate people's thoughts on this, whether I start going to weekly reads or whether I stick with monthly or do some kind of hybrid model. My main reason for thinking about that is I realise that these monthly reviews end up just being a lot of books being thrown at people all at once, and a few people in the comments have said, you know, they almost want a bit more time with certain books, you know, me talking about certain books. Not like I need any encouragement to babble for longer, but you get the point. So these are some more books that I finished in January and really greatly enjoyed for the most part. So first up, I want to talk about The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell, which is a sort of, is a sort of 500-ish page book that I read as part of my local book club. They have a regular book club and a big fat book club, of which this 500-page chunker is in the latter part. And this I thought was a really interesting book, and I was really excited about the idea of it. It's essentially a sort of sci-fi book written around Zambia and bringing in basically things around science fiction, colonialism, sort of local culture, all these sorts of bits, all in sort of enmeshed. And its book is actually also was also referenced in a book that I read recently, which is Out of the Sun by Ezia Dugian, where she talks about this book and the author, and also the failed space mission for Zambia that is referenced in this book, and it's sort of this really interesting historical touch point. And I think this is what's actually quite clever about this book, is much of it deals with actual real life history, so colonialism, HIV and AIDS, malaria, and brings in lots of sort of science fiction elements that kind of take it to a new level. So it feels very grounded in reality, and then something happens, you're like, oh wait, hang on. And so there are, without spoiling it, there are sort of mosquito-like creatures that you eventually realise are like mini drones that are doing things. And it's kind of interesting to sort of see what a hyper sort of technological future of a country like Zambia might be like. And it's kind of this really interesting sort of almost Afrofuturism kind of focus on the future of what could a society look like that had sort of different things happening. It still very much acknowledges colonialism, it still very much acknowledges some other parts, but yeah, I thought it was really interesting. And I don't really read much science fiction, not intentionally, it just sort of is not often, you know, I've got quite a long TBR and I don't always really get around to new things as much, but I really enjoyed this and I thought this was quite clever. I'd be keen to read more from this author, but it didn't always work. It's a good solid 4 stars for me, but I thought it was so interesting in what it did, and I liked that it was really reaching for this sort of new territory of reading and writing. And so yeah, I thought that was really clever. Next, I read Wise Children by Angela Carter, and I have mentioned her several times before. I adore Angela Carter. I think I read Wise Children like years and years and years ago when I was maybe like 17 or 18, which I like to think is just a couple of years ago, but it's not. My knees tell a very different story. But Wise Children by Angela Carter is just this beautiful, funny, bawdy, lyrical book focusing on this set of twin sisters, and they are sort of this vaudeville performance burlesque kind of characters. Sorry. And it's just really fun because these characters go and do their thing, they perform, they celebrate, but it's all told with this very kind of authentic accent and dialect and everything, told by one of the twins. And it's just so, like, I know these women. I feel like I know these women. I feel like I grew up around these women. It's such an authentic accent and dialect. This sort of estuary, like Queen's estuary English kind of thing. For anybody from the UK or anybody who knows the soap EastEnders, very kind of Dot Cotton, and I just love it. I love this so much. I love Angela Carter. She has a real ability to tell stories that feel both very dated and very modern at the same time. Like, they deal with very kind of old settings, but told in a really interesting, fun way. They always have this really great accent and sort of perspective to them. They're always very imaginative, and the writing is beautiful and lyrical, and everything. It's amazing. So I, as you can maybe tell, loved this, and I am hoping to read a bit more Angela Carter this month as well, if nothing else, just to lead up to what would have been her birthday as well. So all very, very good, and look forward to that as well. Continuing what was a bit of a weird mix of books, but a really fabulous set of books, I think, this month, I read Gwendolyn Riley's My Phantoms. And this, I listened to it as an audiobook, and I listened to it all within one day, because it's only about 5 hours. And it's so interesting. In some ways, it's hard to put a finger on what it is at times, but it involves a lot of sort of family drama, and kind of particularly intergenerational sort of family drama, linked with a lot of tales around place and geography, and this kind of the phantoms of the book are kind of these recurring things and sort of neuroses almost that the character can't really let go of. And I'd seen a lot of people really raving about this book, and I see why. It's so singular and focused in its dialect and in its focus. It's focused in its focus. Well done, Bob. It's really, yeah, it's so singular and sort of concentrated, and I found it just so utterly convincing. The dialogue was brilliant and really well realised. It felt completely natural to me, and I just thought this was a very, very good book. It's just very solid, really clever, and it's also deceptively short. A lot seems to happen, but it's over very, very few pages, so I was very, very impressed by this. And similarly, I then went sort of back into advanced copy mode, hooray, and I read Bless the Daughter Raised by a Voice in Her Head by Warsan Shire. So Warsan Shire was sort of known, this sort of Somali poet, who she was sort of known for the sort of little poems springing up every so often, particularly at kind of good moments, particularly, you know, her poem about refugees really sort of circulated a lot with sort of recent events, and so it was interesting to read a sort of full-length collection from her, and these poems were really convincing, really clever. There's a real sort of balance with the thing I love in poetry most, which is the sort of softness and gentleness of language followed by these brutal images, and how you kind of make those two things sit side by side. So dealing with some really quite serious topics. I mean, this is, you know, content warning over a lot of this book. It deals with quite a lot of quite heavy themes, to say the least, but I think it does it really well and convincingly. It never, for me, felt self-indulgent. It never felt like it was, you know, underselling certain things. I just always thought it kind of hit the right note really, really well throughout. I also read two other collections of poetry around the same time. One was Alice Oswald's Falling Awake, which I was so blown away by. This was recommended to me by the wonderful Roz over at Scally Dandling Around the Books, and I mean, she's wonderful, and so I was sort of primed to trust her on this anyway. But Alice Oswald's collection here is stunning. It's sort of these nature poems, but again, there's this really clever observation going on, this real sort of tangible nature of the writing, while talking about nature, and it is just so clever and beautiful. And I think I came away from these poems with a sense of awe, not only at the writing, but of nature itself, which, you know, in many ways I'm sort of predisposed to, because I love writing about nature anyway. But I was really impressed by this and just thought this was such a great collection. And I also, around the same time, read Andrew McMillan's Playtime, which at one point contained probably what is one of, like, the poem that's probably hit me the hardest ever in my life. I was just sat there like, oh gosh, like complete gut punch. I'm getting emotional thinking about it again. Andrew McMillan, I've read his collection, Physical, which I adored. And this sort of deals in many ways with some similar themes, but from a different sort of perspective. So Physical deals a lot with bodies and men's bodies and their relationships to them. Playtime deals a little bit with that, but also particularly men's relationships to sexuality, and to kind of the vulnerability of all of that. And there was a poem in here, like several poems in here, that just completely blew me away. The language is so cleverly observed. It finds the exact sweet spots, that's the word, of being descriptive and funny and bawdy and clever and harsh and dark and everything. And I just think this is sublime, and I know that people often struggle with getting into poetry. That's a thing I often have as well. So I tend to stick to the poets who I have already enjoyed. Andrew McMillan being one who I will basically read anything of, I think, now. But I just think there's so much beauty in some poetry, at kind of finding the exact moment and sort of just examining one moment. It doesn't have to be a full story or a full novel. Sometimes you just need that little focus on something that really makes you think differently. So I really, really appreciated this book. Last up, I read a few other books that were kind of a bit of a mix. So first was Khaled Hosseini's And the Mountains Echoed. So I've read a couple of his other books before. This is a really beautiful tale of sort of various characters around Afghanistan and their kind of interlinking lives, particularly around class and race and gender and sexuality, and some things like that. And although, you know, like it's a very warm, generous tale. It's kind of, again, almost reminds me a bit of Elif Shafak in that really beautiful way she has of bringing people in and you know, just sort of telling you a story. You know, it doesn't always have to be about a big, important political point. Sometimes it's just about telling a story and telling it very well. And this book does that beautifully. And these interlinking stories felt very genuine and sort of connected and whatever as well. So I really did enjoy this. It was just a very pleasurable read, even despite some of the harsher elements that come into it. I also read, somebody in the comments of a video before had spoken about, I'd been speaking about my love of Milkman by Anna Burns, and they mentioned that I should check out Little Constructions by her. And this was a while ago, so I reserved it from the library ages ago, and I've only really now received it and been able to read it. And this, in very similar ways in some ways to Milkman, has this sort of very tight, almost dense narrative structure with characters constantly going off on tangents. And so it's sort of stream of consciousness, but it's also just very conversational. You know, a character will be saying something and then we're like, you know, like when I went down to the shops, you remember Brenda with the big hair? No, not Brenda with the bag. Brenda, you know, and we'll just sort of go off on these little tangents. That wasn't an excerpt from the book, by the way. Just, she writes much better than that. I don't think any characters are called Brenda. What you get is this almost very complicated story, but in a way that's almost farcical, because these characters are so obfuscating every single part of the tale. You know, nobody can get to the bottom of it because all of these sisters and brothers all have names that begin with J, and they all just always refer to each other. It's like Johnny and Jared and blah 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 and blah blah blah. And it's just really silly and really funny, but the narrative voice, once you get inside that head of it, is brilliantly done. It's so clever, and it for me, it's spot on with how it approaches certain parts. So I really enjoyed this. Towards sort of middle, towards the end, I sort of lost a bit of the pace of it, but overall I think it was really good. And you can see exactly the kind of writer Anna Burns is in Milkman from this book as well. You can see how sort of interested she is in that sort of that patter of speech and how people speak. So yeah, really enjoyed this and thought it was great. Unfortunately, I can't necessarily say that for the next book I'm about to come to quite as much. I still did enjoy it overall, but this is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And I'd heard it recommended to me by a few people and kind of wanted to check it out, listen to the audiobook. And what I will say is, overall, I really enjoyed this book. My issue with it is sort of structural, and that sometimes feels harder because it feels... I can't kind of just say like, oh yeah, this thing didn't work or whatever. For me, it was quite complicated to try and explain why I didn't always get on with it. So the story itself is Evelyn Hugo is this actress. She has had 7 husbands, hence the title. And she's at the end of her life telling her life story. But the difficulty, and there's a young woman who is reporting and is writing this for her. And the kind of original premise, or the initial premise rather, of the book is that this young woman is writing, I think Monique, I think she's called, is writing this story and kind of hearing it, but she doesn't really understand why she's been chosen specifically. And my issue with it was that part, because actually all of the Evelyn Hugo bits, I thought she was a really interesting character. She is at turns loving and brutal and difficult to be around, but also incredibly caring and loving. And so she makes terrible decisions, often for self-preservation, because she knows that, you know, as a as a queer woman of colour, sort of fighting for roles in Hollywood, she's got a difficult time, and particularly she can't be open about so many things in her life. Anyway, that part I thought was really, really good and really well done. For me, structurally, what didn't work was we're meant to have this person interviewing her and listening to her and writing the story, and initially we're told that it's because this person is such a great writer. What bugs me is that is a difficult thing to do, right? To kind of say, oh, my character here is super interesting and unique and is a great writer. Because what happens then is I'm then like scrutinizing every single thing they say and being like, but this person's a bit basic in every single way. Like, this kind of character's just like, poor Larry over at Larry Has Opinions had to deal with me texting him just sort of rants about how much I did not like this character as a they felt like a device rather than a character, and I will explain why. Because we're told that they're a really interesting and amazing writer, and yet they're constantly like, but me? Why me? But I'm just a writer. I'm a writer who writes. But why me? I don't know. But I'm only a special writer. And I'm like, oh my God. Like, I feel like someone who is this good a writer, and is chosen specifically because of how good she is as a writer, would have slightly more interesting thoughts than this throughout the book, which then set me up for the next thing with, so if this is all a ruse and she's not actually an amazing writer, or she is an amazing writer but she wasn't chosen for that, that reveals to me that there are going to be some plot twists that link to this, so there's a connection between the two women or something, which for me then completely threw off the balance of the book, because I think I'd have much rather heard Evelyn Hugo tell all of her story, and the twists come from the things that she doesn't tell, right? The stories she's not telling anybody. And I hate to compare books, but I think there is a good natural comparison here, which is The Actress by Anne Enright, which I think does this really well, of showing a public versus private persona of an actress through the eyes of the daughter. And it's so beautifully written, it's lyrical, it's genius, and I love it. And for me, Evelyn Hugo falls down because we're meant to believe all the way through that someone's listening to all of the story, which is a difficult narrative structure, because essentially what that sets up is, that there's going to be some kind of tension between these two women that drives parts of the plots forward. However, because that for me felt like it was signposted so early, because really brilliant writer turned out to just have really basic thoughts. I'm being uncharitable here, but maybe not that much. That kind of to me tells me, okay, well, there's some link between these two women that's going to come out towards the end of the book. And sometimes that's good, that builds up anticipation, like, ooh, what's the twist going to be? But then we kind of got to some of the twists, and I was like, oh, okay, the twists I imagined in my head were much more interesting. And so, I don't know, it fell down. I think I would have really loved this book as a restructured thing of Evelyn Hugo telling her story, but also trying not to tell details, but also not being able to help herself, and accidentally revealing things or holding certain things back. And that, I think, is more fun as a reader, because you are reading between the lines. Whereas with this, we're told the story, and then we're kind of just waiting for somebody to kind of be like, oh, but that's my cousin, or, but not on a Tuesday. Again, not direct quotes from this book, but you get where I'm going with this. Now that I've stopped ranting, I'll come to the final book I read this month, which was Mrs. Engels by Gavin McCrea. And this is a book that I've been meaning to read for the absolute longest time, partly because Eric Carl Anderson over at Lonesome Reader absolutely loves it, partly because this copy that I'm holding right now was given to me by a friend to borrow about a year ago, and I keep on meaning to read it. And also, this is one of the books that I put as being in my list of the TBR list to try and get through this year as well. So this story, Gavin McCrea's Mrs. Engels, focuses on this woman, Lizzie, who is an Irish woman who's moved to London, and she, in the meantime, has just this really beautiful kind of story. She, in terms of talking about dialect and being convincing, this book is so well written in terms of who Lizzie is as a person, how we understand her dialect, and kind of its relationship to her history. She's this Irish woman, she's working class, and I just thought this was so well done. And in the meantime, this whole discussion around class and identity. Engels, Friedrich Engels features in the book, as you'd expect. Karl Marx features, and it really just is this brilliant description of characters who are fighting for workers' rights, and the workers themselves, and kind of how everybody all connects in. I think this is brilliantly done. Such a convincing point of view with Lizzie. It's so comical at times, these very sort of highfalutin kind of concepts flying around her, and she still sort of talks with this real kind of Irish brogue, and it's brilliant. So yeah, I thought this was brilliant. Such good fun as a book, and I really I took to it and just was so warmed by it as well. So that's the final book that I read from this month's sort of wrap up. But I'd love to hear what you read. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on books that you've been reading and how you've been finding them. If you've read any of these or other works by by the same authors, or even just similar books, I'd love to hear them and hear those recommendations. Also, just if you have any thoughts on whether you'd prefer to see weekly reads or monthly reads wrap-ups, all good. I'm happy either way. I've been Bob the Booker, rambling about books. Kill surprise. Take care, and I'll speak to you all very soon. Bye bye.